And I also am informed that Billy has been thinking about labour mobility for quite a long time, and so I think it's timely at the moment with opportunities for Fiji, but really looking forward to hearing his ideas about labour mobility today. And we also have Melione Wera, Director, Matala Limited, and former head of Tonga Labour Sending Unit. So I think Melione is here with her extensive experience, formerly working with Tongan government but no longer. So at the moment she's a private training provider, but again has extensive practical experience in labour mobility. So I'm going to invite Melione Wera to be our first presenter.
Thank you, Jane, and thank you for the introduction. Thank you for flicking the order as well, and now I have to take it on and be the first. Firstly, before I start, I'd like to thank and acknowledge ANU for the invitation and the opportunity to be here and share my experiences from a Pacific perspective and from a Tongan perspective. I'd like to just get this going. So what I will be presenting on will be a lot of Tongan stories, Tongan perspective, but in some cases may be relevant to the Pacific as well. You can see from the picture that it's the ideal thing that you think of when you think of the Pacific Island, especially when you run away from Canberra and when it's very cold. This is the ideal. It's a lovely beach, it's a sunny day, it's sandy, and you get to relax. So sometimes when we say Pacific, that's already what's painted in our mind. A quick outline of what I'm going to be talking about. I will be bringing onto the table just how I view it, 3 different issues that may be worth looking at as we continue to look at this great program and how it can benefit the Pacific in the future. You notice that it's in story form. In the Pacific Island, we love to tell stories. We say this talanoa, we say it as sharing, we have it as conversation, and quite a lot of times that's how we get to communicate, and a lot of the policies come out of us conversing and that. So there is going to be one where put onto the table thinking on gender participation, absentees of mothers, any link to crimes in the Pacific or in Tonga specifically, just the story behind it and putting it out there. Story number 2 will be around reintegration, how we see the gaps of what can we look at into reintegration. Very often we hear is at the end of the process, but just putting in stories there and asking the question of is that really where it is and how effective can we maximize, can it be there, or is there another side to it, and just looking into it as a research topic in future. And if the lali goes off, I'll stick to story 2, but if it doesn't, that there is a backup story for story number 3, and that's just around community training. The state of preparedness, and when we talk about, there's a lot of preparation, there's a lot of talking about quality of workers when they get to the other side. Much of that, how effective is the current system and what other ways is currently happening on the ground and we may be looking at. So those are the 3 things that I will be covering in my presentation. Number 1 will be just around the question of gender participation. There's a lot of talk we've heard through the week of looking at gender participation, the Pacific Labour Scheme, H sector and tourism sector coming up, that pattern and highly likely how that would increase the gender. But there's that question, and it's a social issue from the other side, or from a Pacific Island perspective when you're in Tonga. And I will share the story just in relation to Tonga of how can we, is there a risk or is there a study that can be taken place given our youth crime and our current state. Again, this is a picture that actually depicts and actually shows Tonga, this is actually 5 minutes down from the road from my house. This is a typical summer school holiday, part of the kids enjoying the beach, and that's what ideally that you think of. Right now, the current issue in Tonga, I cannot pronounce the word, so I'll stick to P or meth, but you know that methamphetamine word. So that drugs, when I refer to it, that's what I will be talking about, drugs, youth, and labor mobility. And is there any interconnection and how we can mitigate or just that whole issue. So not the exact same beach, but on the 10th of December 2018, this is part of a news that hit New Zealand. It was on One News, there was a coverage of Tonga, talking about it and highlighting our country and declaring that there is a national issue of drugs in the country. And so it was talking about, rather than a kingdom of Tonga, there was that coverage on the news in New Zealand about Kingdom of I.T.S. And this actually really shook the countries, the whole communities. You're talking about mothers and fathers, churches. So quite a lot of stakeholders and a lot of bodies had to realize when these came out into the public that this is the reality of what we face, what the workers are facing, or this is the current situation in our country. Our current situation, as I referred to, there was a One News exclusive, and they covered it over 2 different sessions, Barbara Driver, and it really highlighted Tonga and the effect of how it's happening right now. This is as recent as late December. Some facts over consultation over the last 6 months. Our prison population now, more than 12% are drugs offenders. Our mental health system, 46%, these are 2018 figures. 46% of admissions are direct results of drug use. We don't have a rehab facility per se. When you talk about drugs and overseas, you can take them to a rehab. We don't have that in the island. We don't have that in Tonga. So you're really looking at a context of if you have young people or if you have users of this, we have limited facilities in the country to actually get them off. And so I'm just highlighting some of that. Over the last 6 months, after this particular news came out, a recent drugs task force was established, and within less than 6 months, 211 arrests have been made. The age range, the youngest had been a 13-year-old young person, and the oldest person is 63. Majority of the offenders, though, are between the age of 20 to 40. Although we don't have evidence-based, and this is talking totally about drugs and crime, and while there's no real key evidence in the consultation over the last couple of months, there are 3 clear factors that affects it, and one is broken families, peer pressure, and economic reasons. You probably are wondering now, why am I making a presentation and I'm talking about drugs? And I'm talking about painting a totally different context that's actually has nothing to do with labor mobility. Please bear with me. Now, Tonga, what I've just shared is a very, very current issue. It's as current as by lunchtime today, we have this is becoming the normal for Tonga. Another drugs arrest, this is on the 3rd of July, it just came out today. They arrested 8 people, 5 packs of ice, live bullets, cash from 2 different locations. So this came out today. That demonstrates to you that while we have labor mobility, there's a current issue at play and can potentially affect our work and the efforts in what we do in the labor mobility. Now, while that focuses on Tonga, I'd like to just one slide before I continue on to how it links to labor mobility, on that it's not just limited to Tonga, it's a Pacific issue. This is just came out on the 23rd of June, and this is an article about here in Fiji, but just the fact that this is a risk for the Pacific, not just isolated to Tonga, about drugs and its impact and how it actually travels through and happens to come through these islands, the nice blue water type of photos. What does this have to do with labour mobility? Majority of the offenders in Tonga arrested are between the age of 20 and 40. Our targeted age group in Pacific Labour Scheme is between the age of 21 and 45. You're talking about, when we look at it further, we tend to wonder, I wonder that while it may seem isolated, when you're talking about building the quality of a work-ready pool, when you're talking about in Tonga improving that quality of working to actually get people on board, you begin to think, if there is no correlation, but can there be some way where a whole lot of stakeholders or research can be done where you can actually look at how you can contribute, because you're looking at the same age group and you're looking at, there's a potential that in the future, and I think in some cases it's emerging, the users, how they get through our recruitment system, and while it may not be drugs, it is a matter of time, and if this is not controlled on our end, it may actually affect the quality in the long run when you look at the scheme and how it actually ends up at the employer side. So while it's again something that's playing a very critical part on the ground, it's actually establishing that link and seeing it and seeing how can we do or what can we do. Is there something that we can just take note of as we anticipate that these current issues are happening in the Pacific? The three highlighted clear factors contributing to drugs usage in Tonga came out as broken families, peer pressure, and economic reasons. The reason why we've just highlighted it and looking at labour mobility, as I am working in the community, you tend to think of how can you mitigate or how can we contribute to this, or that whole issue of separation of families, while we understand that this is much needed and this is the way the Pacific Labour Scheme is going. It's good to actually note these and actually realize that these are happening on the grounds, and broken families and peer pressure. And that takes me back to that whole question of, in terms of peer pressure, in terms of our youth, in terms of crime, and the absence of the role of a mother in the country for prolonged months. Sometimes you hear the story of mothers going so that they can get money to educate their children, and then when you bump into them, they say, we're no longer going because when we came back, they've dropped out and we didn't realize. So the exact reason why you actually went and separated from your family, because you're not at home, that kind of purpose, it didn't actually come into fruition. And you're one step or two step back, because now you have children or teenagers that are not in school. And it is just really putting it out there. That's just more on the social side. It was just painting, giving you that story, giving you that context, giving you that background that I feel sometimes we may be isolated when we look at our labour scheme, when we look at just sending workers. But it is good to be mindful and realize what's happening on the ground. When these workers come back, when they don't have any avenue of economic returns for the 5 months that they're back in country, these are some of the things that are at play, and that can actually affect the quality of our workers if there is no initiative, or if we don't take notice of it and work together with other stakeholders, with other agencies, to see what we can do to actually make sure that we improve the quality of our workers and work-ready pool. Everyone is very quiet. I'll continue on to story number 2, and it's going to be very quick. This again is on a more positive note. So what you've heard before is about is posing that question about the role of mothers on the youth, the peer pressure. If mum is not at home for that 7 months, could that have been a contributing factor to actually teenagers being prone to those temptations and getting themselves in that cycle of the drugs because of the current climate in the country? Story number 2 is actually questioning in terms of reintegration, but it's again talking about role of women, but / partners, and where it can be that whole reintegration in the full stage of labor mobility. These two quick photos is just a photo of the process. Tapa making is very key to our culture. We call it ngatu here in Fiji and even in Samoa. So usually when you see a beautiful piece of tapa, the process to make it actually requires quite a lot of women and a lot of community to drop everything and come and work together. They've got to agree, they've got to figure out a way of actually surviving together, because that's how they can actually produce this. And so that was just to demonstrate that the current efforts in Tonga, these are the wives of SWP partners that are currently in Bowen, and they're doing this exact thing in Tonga. While their husbands are away, usually they get together once a week and they work together and they do this. This is Richard Curtin actually doing an interview with these women, and this is just, and this is as recent as May, where we get to talk to them and we get to have direct contact with them of what they do, because I've had the warning. But all that means, this is what they actually aim to get, and this is the reality of what they get. A piece of tapa, you can see that I got this from the internet. A small piece is about 75 US when you sell it on the internet. For these women, when they get together and they do this once a week, they can, by December, and that is their goal right now, this group of women, each of them will get about 5,000 US, it's about 10,000 Tongan, for each of their investment, as they give 1 day a week. But why is this coming out as part of reintegration? Because I feel that a lot of times we talk in your pre-departure, in a lot of the pre-departure training is very employment focused, and the pre-departure briefings, it's very about contracts, it's very about, it focuses on workers out there. And then there is that reintegration part where you deal with that when the workers come home. What you saw just then was reintegration at play while the workers are out there, because every week the money to actually fund that piece of tapa that each woman comes and puts on the table and create together as a community, that money is funded from the SWP partners as they are overseas. So it's actually talking about reintegration. Is there any way that it can be looked at and you can involve households at the preparation stage of how economic benefits are actually utilized? The above story actually demonstrates the power of having reintegration efforts at the beginning, or when they talk about it and when they understand it prior to going. And that's just something I thought I'd put on the table, because many times when we hear, even before, when we hear of some of the negative reports, or sometimes we come back, they come back and there is no results. And some of it is because maybe you needed to get the household together. Maybe you can talk about how you spent your money together, redirect some effort, and what happened if you can do those goal setting, at the beginning as a household. Stephen referred yesterday to the fact that in the Pacific Island, they need to be more mentally prepared. And I think in being mentally prepared to take this on, because the mass demand is there and it's going to keep growing. But if we are to mitigate some of these issues, it is important to reassess ourselves, and maybe that's why reintegration sometimes is not really up there, because we try to deal with it as the end, whereas it would have maximized its benefits if we actually deal with it at the beginning for the whole household before they actually get on that plane. I will skim right through on 3, but that was, I wanted to just highlight in terms of on the ground, the role of community training as a tool to improve. And these are just photos of a group of women. Some of them are partners of SWP workers, and this is pulling them together. We conducted this in March, and putting them together, getting them to actually talk about what they want, actually getting to just talk. Sometimes in the Pacific, when you talk business, they think, oh no, there's a negative thing to business, because business means you're making money, and then business means you're greedy. Whereas if you put them in a group and you say, no, 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 this is not about business. This is actually us just getting together and having a plan, having a look at what we can do together, having a look at your goals or what you can actually, rather than singling it out, you actually talk to them as a group. They do come forward, and this is part of what they did as we worked together through a week of goal setting and financial literacy and business planning. After one community training of 27 women, so far we've held 4 market days, once every month, and the next one will be on the 20th of July. Just some key photos. They got together, never been done before. This is a community of the people that actually was in a community training. Get together, whatever they got at home, the whole idea is, okay, you've done this, just go. If you know how to bake, figure it out. Get your husband overseas to give you some money for ingredients. But let's just walk you through on how you can make some money and not just wait for him to send that. Let's start generating something while they are away. So that's some of the effort in when I'm talking about community training. As I said, I'm coming from a perspective, I'm not in government, and so there's that flexibility to do this. We don't see this being done inside government, and understandably, because there's limitation of resources and there's a focus on pre-departure training. But then when you see this on the ground, you tend to think, maybe we can just maximize, maybe we can actually research more on how we can actually build on these, because these are great potentials that can actually double, triple the effect of the Pacific Labour Scheme. In that current context on community training, I looked at it and these photos, I tend to wonder, okay, we saw that and we heard that in May, some of these families, they got, a group of 6 women were able to quantify, they actually generated over a weekend of Children's Sundays for Tonga, they generated 3,018 pa'anga. So we were quite excited that they are able to quantify that in terms of economic terms. But when they get together, it actually contributes to mitigating social impacts. And while we don't have the data, and while we're just talking about what's happening on the ground, the question I'd like to pose is that, is this an area that maybe, if checked out further, it is an area that can contribute to the labor scheme, labor mobility in the future? On the same market day, we begin to see the elderlies coming through. We begin to see the children. One woman said, her husband actually can send her money to hire a jumping castle, and then she can just charge. And so, of course, the mothers are at the field, and the mothers are bringing their children, and it was affordable. It was like 50 cents, $1. But she's able to make some money because of just actually opening up the door, and they can create that on the spot. So that has continued on for the last 4 months. But the fact that you have children and you have the elderlies in one place sometimes creates that whole, when I refer to that whole platform of them talking, sometimes it actually opens up doors when they begin to talk to each other, sometimes of the struggles of their husbands or their wives in going in the labour scheme, something that's they wouldn't necessarily go through into the government office if they have that problem. But when you begin to create those platforms in the community for them to talk to each other, you realize that maybe this type of approach, if improved or if looked at further, can actually serve 2 purposes. Not only maximize the economic benefits, but it can mitigate the social impacts, because there are some ways you create yourself that social network in a way that you feel comfortable with. So that's actually getting to the end of it. But just one key point I wanted to make, with all that community training, there's a gap. There's a gap because you have the partners and you have the families, and we've heard in the social impact presentation about the impact on children. But sometimes they're there in the country, in the villages, and we have the funding, we have development partners, we have the governments on the other side. But there are figures, the role, what is the role of those that does the go-between? This lady, she is the lady that Richard and I went and and visited and interviewed. Never been, she hasn't got any of her family on the SWP program. However, she's the one pulling together all the wives of those that are traveling on the SWP program to Bowen. So she's a key figure. She's the one that came out, approached me, and I said, I heard that you do this, can we do this, can you write a proposal? So she acts as an agent, and they play that role of facilitating it and actually enabling benefits or enabling some kind of training so that you can reach over to the people that we're really looking at and we're targeting. So it's actually just talking and putting out there the role of intermediary and what it can do in the community level. That's just me. I wanted to just show my face as I sit there on the floor. That's not a normal, that's a normal meeting in Tonga where in the community hall with a group of women, the women that we ended up doing those market days. But again, what the whole purpose here is to demonstrate the importance and how we can actually utilize those roles on those ground levels and how that can actually help get this program and actually just get a whole lot more benefits. And so I think that's it. I think I've touched on this, where it's just a summary of that story about community training, the strength of the community work in the Pacific. That is a strength that we see, the platform for communities to get together. When they do business together, when they come back, they come on the market day, they don't feel as bad about sharing because they see that as a community achievement where they talk about their money in a sense where they don't feel they'll be criticized or they'll be expected to actually just dish it out to the neighbors or to someone else. And so I thought there'd be an opportunity there for social issues to be shared. I think I've shared this all in the last slide. Now what? This will be my last slide. What do we all have in common? And I'm posing this question, what do we all have in common? Australians, Tongans, Samoans, Fijians, and this labour mobility. There's something that surely we all want to get. And I think it's wanting this scheme to work. It's wanting to see individuals, and we want our societies, we want our communities to be proud Tongans, proud Pacific Islanders, and to be named and known as effective workers, and that they can help Australians just as the same way that this program is helping them. Matala, the meaning of matala is actually blossom, to bud forth. It also means to explain, to clarify. In Samoa, it means to open wide. And so I leave this, I knew Jane this morning quoted one of the RSC workers saying that what he was really after was new skills, new dreams, new opportunities. I think at a different level, and whether we're on the policy making side or whether we're on the ground, whether we're in the Pacific or in different institutions, one thing we do all have in common is we want these kind of programs to work. We want it to matala, we want it to blossom, we want it to actually come out so that each and every one can benefit. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Melione, for sharing that broader community perspective. That was wonderful. I'd now like to invite Vilimone Balandroka to speak.
Thank you, Jane. Bula, everyone. I know it's late in the afternoon, but Matt, you are not alone. I also came without a PowerPoint presentation. Okay, anyway, the context of my my contribution is really against the latest International Labour Conference that I just came back from last week in Geneva, and looking at the global perspective of mobility and really looking at the future of work. When we look at, I mean, for us at the Ministry of Employment or Labour, ILO really sets the context for us, I mean, in moving forward on the standards and the international conventions. So in that context, this year ILO celebrated its 100 years of existence. And in the recent conference, we were looking at the focus of ILO in the next 100 years. So the issue of the future of work, while we're talking about labor mobility, looking at it in the Pacific context, here in the region with our colleagues from Australia and New Zealand. I think I will focus on 4 areas which I thought is going to be I mean, a challenge as we move forward. And the first one really, as I said, this is from the context of the global forces that are affecting the whole labor market when we look at it. This has been mentioned, I'm sure, throughout the week. We look at globalization, technological advancement, demographic transitions, and of course climate change for us here in the Pacific. So the first issue that I want to look at is really on the future jobs. What will really be these future jobs and skills that's going to be required? I know it's been talked about earlier. Professor Satish talked about this in his, just in the previous session. But what really is going to be a challenge on what will be the future jobs that we will be looking at? When we look at mobility, the future jobs that's going to be required domestically, likewise in the receiving countries. And coming with that is really that relevant skills. So managing this whole process is going to be very critical, particularly given the different levels of reforms that we have in our nations here in the Pacific, and talk about jobs and skills for the future. The whole context of our education system. I know in the earlier session we look at the inadequacy of the primary school systems that we have here in the Pacific. So it's going to be a key challenge when we look at the whole education reforms and where we are at this point in time when we want to project the jobs and skills for the future. So I thought it's going to be an area of interest or more research into that area. So there's a need for this continual reskilling and upskilling. While people go on labor mobility, when we send our people across, for us here in Fiji, we are sending the most isolated rural communities. People that, some of them are coming to Nandi International Airport for the first time. So imagine from there, and then they fly across to Brisbane or in Sydney or Auckland for that matter. So there's going to be a real need for reskilling. The work that they do there is totally different from what they do here. So the need to identify these critical skills that they will do, and likewise for the jobs that they will do. So our people in the Pacific will definitely need this, given our geographical remoteness. So it's going to be very critical for us. The second issue is really on social protection. I'm sure this is not new as well. The issue of reintegration has been mentioned. Mele mentioned that, the issue of reintegration. We are thinking in the context of while people are there, what can be done here for the family, so the dependents. So we were thinking of, I know Dr. Satish talked about this earlier, the need for a fund. Here in Fiji, we're thinking of establishing a fund for these migrant workers. So at least there's a fund there available for their dependents, for their children that they can access for their education, likewise for their spouses, if they want to start SME, small and micro enterprises. But there's a fund available that workers can contribute to when they go, and at the same time it's always available there. Okay? So as I said, I mean, with us here at in our local context with the National Employment Center, we actually got that by legislation, you know, the establishment of this fund, so that it's part of this whole reintegration program. When workers go, there is always an avenue available there for their immediate families that they can access in terms of their children's education and venturing into new opportunities or business opportunities. The third issue is really on the need for a well-functioning multilateral, or call it bilateral, as well as a unilateral system right across, both from the sending to the receiving countries. I think that's very, very important. I know refer back to the 108th session of ILC, International Labour Conference, where Director ILO, Guy Ryder, talks about a more equitable future of work. I think that's very, very critical to all of us in here on the sharing of gains, right? How the gains from labor mobility, both in the sending and receiving countries, how that can be properly distributed, so that there's a real triple win from labor mobility. So it's really about thinking about a future of growth where it's shared, where growth is inclusive and is participatory, which has the interest of everyone. And my last point is really about the business of the future. It's going to be related to the previous one. Business of the future, when we look at the contribution of the private sector, when we look at this whole process of labor mobility, while we appreciate the provision of employment as a major contribution by private sector, but is that enough? When we can look further into the corporate social responsibility of employers, right? Particularly to the sending countries. How can we develop that further? You know, the social responsibility of employers, particularly when we look at the sharing of gains. When we've seen the growth of industries in the receiving countries, the growth of declining industries, when we see the growth of horticulture industries, and when we look at the whole industry right across. So I thought that can be an area as well that we've had some good stories, some very good stories. When we hear from employers, some very good employers that are doing this, coming back to the sending countries and really committing to the growth of the sending countries or the respective communities. But I'm sure there's a scope there that we can tap further in really ensuring that there's triple wins on this labor mobility. Thank you very much.
Thank you, really. It was good timing that you've just come from Geneva, fresh with ideas from the ILO. And you deserve a gold star for coming in under your time. So well done. I'd now like to invite Matthew Dornan to speak to us.
Thanks very much, Jane, and good afternoon, everyone. I will try to be as brief as possible because I'm conscious we don't have much time left, and it is also a Friday afternoon and no one wants to stick around after 5 o'clock. So I'm going to be talking about, I guess, a program of work that the ANU, the Australian National University, the Development Policy Centre specifically, and the World Bank have been developing for some time now. I'm a little uniquely placed to talk about this because I'm only recently part of the World Bank. So I joined in March, and before that I worked in the Development Policy Centre. If there's one thing that I've learnt at the bank so far, it's the law of three. So always structure everything according to 3 main points, regardless of whether you have 4 or 5 points to make. So I'm going to do that now. And I thought I would speak first about, I guess, my view of how analytical work and research contributes and has contributed to the expansion of labour mobility opportunities for Pacific Islanders. Secondly, I'll talk very quickly about the research priorities that we've identified, but at a fairly high level. And then thirdly, I'll talk a little bit about our approach to this. So in terms of the role of analytical work and research, you know, attribution is always something that is very hard to establish, but I do think that that advocacy and underpinning that advocacy, that analytical work has really played an important part in the expansion of these schemes. And I'm thinking about the RSE in New Zealand and the seasonal worker program in Australia in particular. And this really, to think about the context, you're talking about schemes for which the main beneficiaries, the Pacific Islander workers, are essentially disenfranchised. You know, they don't vote in Australian elections, they don't vote in New Zealand. And employers, at least historically, there's only been a very small number as these schemes were established, so you didn't really have an employer group that was strongly advocating these schemes. So that's where I think researchers have really played, or research and researchers have played an important part in their establishment. And if I'm to point to 2 reports that I think are examples of this, one is the At Home and Away report, which was done in 2006, and you know, so that was done in 2006, and in a context where Pacific Island governments started to really advocate for the establishment of these sorts of schemes. And it was the next year, of course, that the RSE scheme was established in New Zealand. And what this report did was it established a sound base of evidence as to the potential impacts of these schemes for Pacific Islanders. And then the Pacific Possible Labour Mobility report, which I worked on in my ANU capacity. It was both the joint ANU and World Bank report. It started talking more broadly about the expansion of labour mobility opportunities for Pacific Islanders, and one of the things it talked about was the semi-skilled schemes and schemes that weren't just of a seasonal nature. And again, attribution is very hard to establish. I wouldn't say that this has been the driver necessarily, but I think it has certainly contributed to discussions around the sorts of schemes that we've now seen established in Australia with the Pacific Labour Scheme and also in New Zealand. And there are a whole other bunch of examples that I could provide, but I'll skip over them in the interest of time. So I'll talk briefly about the priorities that we've identified, but I will just say quickly at the start that it was quite heartening to listen to John and Kirsty's presentation in the morning, because I think a lot of the research gaps that they've identified are things that we also view as important. I should say there's overlap and crossover between some of these different themes. I don't think we need to worry too much about that. And I would also say that I think we need to keep a flexible mind when approaching research on this topic. These schemes have changed quite quickly. The composition of workers has also been changing, as Stephen pointed out in his presentation. So we really need to retain flexibility in the way that we approach this research. So the first area that we identified, perhaps unsurprisingly, given that the ANU in particular was already doing work in this, was recruitment and governance. So Stephen has already presented on this in the morning, so I won't go into any detail. He did say that work is ongoing. But I would also note that understanding recruitment and governance arrangements are really fundamental when looking looking at some of the issues raised by John and Kirsty in the morning, issues such as equity of access, both between communities, within households that are in the same community, and so forth. Linked to sending country governance is analysis of how pre-departure costs can both be reduced and also financed. So the World Bank study of the impacts of the seasonal worker program in 2018 found that the pre-departure costs that were being incurred by participants from the Pacific were very high by world standards, and that there's clearly scope to reduce some of these costs. Doing so, though, we really need a sound understanding of what these costs are in order to help address them. And I think here there is potentially a link to more tangible operations also, and this is something I'll talk a little bit about at the end. But one of the things that I think the World Bank brings to this is that it can link this analytical work to operations. So we've got a project called Skills and Employment for Tongans project, and it includes a labour mobility subcomponent to it. One of the things we're hoping to do through that project, which is really only getting established now, is to enable workers to apply for these labour mobility schemes without having to travel to Nuku'alofa. And that's a big issue for workers from the outer islands, because it's quite an expense to travel there, and currently they have to do so in order to undertake medical testing, in order to do police checks, in order to attend pre-departure briefings. So it's something that it's fairly simple, but it's a tangible thing that we can contribute. We also see value in examining skills that are available and which are not available in Pacific Island countries, and this of course was the focus of the session in this room just before afternoon tea. And this, I think, really, Satish described this very well with his, I think he called it poor human resource planning, and that's exactly what it is. You have this, this tension where at the one hand you have skills gaps in Pacific Island economies, at the same time you have graduates who aren't able to find work. So really we need to address this and ensure that we have good labour market analysis that is informing the type of skills training that is undertaken in the Pacific. And we have some ideas about how this could take place. Some of this work is already underway, so I.T.S, for example, is already doing a labour market skills assessment, and Richard Curtin from ANU is involved in that. But there are other things that we might be able to do, for example, through support for analysis of regular labour force surveys, strengthening of skills-related questions in HIAS and census surveys. And I think finally we need to look long-term as well. So thinking about how technological change, how competition from other parts of the world in the Australian, New Zealand labour markets, or in fact in any other destination labour market, how that will impact Pacific Island countries. Probably the most important thing, or the most urgent thing that we need to do is look at analysing the impact of the Pacific Labour Scheme. And I say it's urgent because the scheme obviously has already been established, but the numbers are still fairly small. So there's an opportunity to establish a really firm baseline. So that's something that again ANU and the bank are hoping to do very quickly. I mean, in my view, there's obviously been a lot of good work done in terms of the impacts of schemes like SWP or RSC by the likes of John Gibson, David McKenzie and so forth. But I think one of the weaknesses has been that it has tended to be rather ad hoc. So in an ideal world, what I would like to see is the establishment of a more regular sort of survey that actually looks at these impacts. And if you were to do that, it would probably be more of along the style of an omnibus survey, where you're not just looking at the impact of something like the Pacific Labour Scheme, but you're also looking at the impact of other migration schemes that benefit Pacific Islanders. A cross-cutting theme, gender, we thought it was important to include as a standalone theme also, simply because it is so significant. We know that the number of women participating in the seasonal work programs has been very low. That's likely to change with the Pacific Labour Scheme. And of course, the fact that the Pacific Labour Scheme will see workers in Australia for up to 3 years, that has a whole host of other ramifications that we really do need to look at very carefully. And that feeds into this slide on social impacts and reintegration. And that again was something that John and Kirsty highlighted as being an under-researched area. And I would say with all of these things, we need to look across different types of migration and across the different types of schemes, because potentially the impacts will vary quite considerably for them. And that's something that in relation to remittances, I think is very important. So we heard in the morning about the need to facilitate the transfer of superannuation by workers from the Pacific, and also at the fact that remittance costs are so high in the region. So we continue to think about how that might, how those costs might decline. I do think on that remittance cost question, the likely solutions will vary by group. So I think Jane mentioned the Send Money Pacific tool, which is effectively just an information tool that tells you how much different remittance providers, what the costs are for sending money. You know, that might be fine for someone that is used to using these sorts of tools. But if you're talking about someone who, you know, a participant in the seasonal worker program who has never used a tool like that before, it might be far more effective simply to tell them what the, you know, you should send money this way, rather than tell them to log on to a site, go through all the hoops and so forth. And then finally, the impact in recipient communities. So this, you know, this is important because it goes to the question of the acceptability of these schemes in Australia and in New Zealand. So if we can provide a firm evidence base that actually these schemes are really good for rural communities, and I think there's a case to be made for that, then I think we have a much better chance of making this a long-term fixture of the migration programs of countries like Australia and New Zealand. So that's a very brief overview of the priorities as we're currently thinking about them. In terms of the roles of the various organisations, just briefly, you know, I think the ANU and the World Bank have a good history of working together. I expect that will continue. We each bring different things to the table. You know, the Development Policy Centre is much better placed to play that advocacy role that I talked about earlier. And, you know, I think they've been very effective at doing that. The World Bank, you know, it has a lot of international experience and expertise that it can draw on. And there's also that link to operations, which I think is very important. Clearly, the bank and Dev Policy are not the only organisations working in this space or in the areas that we've identified, and we recognise the need to work with and coordinate with others. So if just looking at this list, you know, the first two priorities, obviously that's an area, well, those are both areas where the Pacific Labour Facility is very much involved, and I'm sure Rochelle will talk about that in a moment. On the third, I already mentioned that APTC is already undertaking some analysis there, which ANU is involved in. I won't go through the whole list, but you get the point. I think we need to work together to help address these research gaps. I'll finish there. Thanks.
Thank you, Matt. Thanks for linking us back to John and Kirsty's presentation in the morning and the rule of three. There wasn't three. Now, we've got Rochelle Ball, who's got the difficult job of the final spot of the day. So thank you for your patience, Rochelle. So let's all give Rochelle our full attention for 10 to 15 minutes.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope I can keep you awake for another 10 or 15 minutes. I'm going to try to keep this pretty brief. And in fact, I think a lot of what I'm going to say recaps on a lot of the themes of today, what Jane covered this morning, what John and Kirsty have covered, and really dovetails very closely with what Matt has said, and also the issues that were identified by Billy and Melione. So, sort of doing the full circle, really Pacific Labour Mobility provides an important opportunity for Pacific development, for Australian regional growth, and for enhancing Australian Pacific foreign relations through and development through people-to-people links. This image here is, I've just lost my, give me a hand, I've got a screen freeze. This image here is of a Kiribati worker working in an aged care facility, and to me the research agenda should be about partnerships, and it should also be about building people-to-people links. And this is really the underpinning the approach the Pacific Labour Facility is taking to research. Now, just I want to talk a little bit briefly about what the Pacific Labour Facility is, and its overall goals. So the goal of Pacific Labour Mobility is to contribute to inclusive economic growth and development of Pacific Island communities. And how it does that is to facilitate sustainable and effective expansion of labour mobility. The labour facility is divided into 4 major teams. The labour facility incorporates Pacific Labour Scheme as well as a seasonal worker scheme, with the exception of the demand side. The demand side is focused on, and the demand team works with Australian employers to expand demand under the Pacific Labour Scheme. I'm part of the Quality and Learning group. And the Quality and Learning group captures, over the last several months, we've been really focusing on the monitoring and evaluation framework and developing baseline data tools. So some of the issues that Matthew mentioned about ongoing data collection will be captured under the Pacific Labour Scheme. So we've developed, for example, 4 surveys for the whole of life for workers. So once on arrival, 1 year after they've been working in Australia, at the completion of their employment, and 3 months after their return. Similarly, we've got instruments developed for worker satisfaction, employer satisfaction, and capacity assessment. And we're in the process of developing baselines. So we haven't really done any real research. We've been setting up the structures and frameworks at this point, with the exception we commissioned John and Kirsty to do a literature review and gaps analysis. So the research will drill down on some of the results of the M&E frameworks. The M&E framework will give us a really clear heads up on the development impacts, but the research will really give us depth of knowledge with what those impacts are and the contributions to development. So I just want to briefly just give you some overview on some guiding principles that the way the PLF is approaching research. So the major challenge or major opportunity of PLF research and contribution is to understand the contribution of labour mobility to Pacific countries and Timor-Leste, and that's the whole of program goal. And this is not just, as Matt just outlined, it's not just about the Pacific Labour Facility. This is about working with partners. This is about working with the World Bank, ANU, and a broader community of researchers. We've identified, or John and Kirsty have identified, 35 research active researchers, and part of the goal of one of the things that we really want to do is work with that broader community of researchers to build up robust, to support robust research across the breadth of areas that John and Kirsty have identified this morning, that there's huge gaps. So, by the way, I hope you're enjoying the nice slides. These are of Pacific workers under the Pacific Labour Scheme in action. So this is a tuna worker in Ulladulla from Tuvalu. So, as I mentioned, and right at my opening slide, our approach is collaborative. We want to commission and do internal research, but also the commissioning research is about building research partnerships. It's strategic, so we've kicked off with a literature review to really help identify priorities. It's about accountability too. They've got a whole of program goal to contribute to economic and social development. Well, research is and the M&E, all the M&E work really needs to shine light on what that contribution is and where it's not working, so we can have an adaptive system where we can adapt the delivery of the program to meet those goals. We're obviously very keen on policy relevant research that will inform Australian and Pacific Island governments and form future policy, and obviously high quality research. So our aims are to build collaborations and partnerships and to build research complementarity. There's a huge amount of work to do, so we want to work with our research partners and not duplicate existing efforts. One of the goals that we've got is to strengthen partner country research capacity. So of the work that we commission, we really would like to have Pacific Island partners involved in that research. We obviously want to liaise with the New Zealand government and other regional bodies to make sure that we build a research complementarity. There's some impacts work that's being commissioned by MFAT, and we want to leverage off those instruments to make sure that we can build not just complementarity but comparability in the work that's being done. So how will we do this? Through funding funding research and our internal research like tracer studies, analysis of the MERL data, and labour market assessment. So we've already done a couple of Australian labour market demand assessments, which obviously complements the work and the charter of the APTC. Also, we'll be putting in place 8 in-country staff to provide research support services, data collections, building data systems, and helping roll out our program of research. In terms of how we'll do this, is we also want to have research that's responsive to the needs of the Australian government and to partner governments, and also to build a research community of practice. So I'd just like to briefly outline a few areas that we're looking at now we're only 5 days into the new financial year. So this is some research ideas that we'd like to have discussion about with you, because we want to make sure that the research that we're doing actually meets partner needs. as well as Australian government needs. So the first piece of research, which also dovetails a lot with what Matt was saying and what Stephen was saying this morning, is about, and John and Kirsty have also highlighted in various ways, is the barriers to research, barriers to participation in labour mobility. And I was really impressed by the work that Jonathan Pike from the Law Institute and the World Bank mapping of poverty in the Pacific that's been presented over the last couple of days. And I'm really keen to have sort of real-time mapping of where Pacific workers are coming from across all 10 partner countries, and how that sort of can be overlaid with poverty mapping, for example, to give us an early sense of impact. Because if workers are coming from the poorest areas, then that's great, because it means that the recruitment systems are actually working to benefit the poorest communities in the Pacific. But if they're not, then that helps policymakers adjust recruitment systems and target particular areas. Also, as part of that sort of broader barriers work, so mapping is one part of that process, and also to targeted qualitative and quantitative research to look at what those barriers mean or what they are, and that will vary by country. So Stephen talked about a lot of the presentation. I thought was excellent because of the diversity of the recruitment systems and what's working, what's not working, and Muriel's presentation really showed an adaptive system in place. So some of these cultural and social barriers to identify administrative and governance barriers, financial barriers, and geographical barriers like remoteness, which goes back to the equity and development impact question. Understanding the development impacts. We've identified a couple of areas. This is just to kick off the program. So the family and gendered impacts. So is labour mobility creating empowerment and gender equality, or is it helping to fuel domestic violence? Is it building family resilience, and what are the impacts on children? So we've had some papers on that this afternoon, and Melioni's her comments and points earlier are part of that broader framing. And then we've also talked about reintegration and return workers. So, and there's under those 4 areas, there's a massive amount of work that sits. So it would be great to receive your comments this afternoon about where you feel are the, like for example, in that second point, which under return workers, there's an enormous amount of work to be done. So where are the highest priorities in that space? And then understanding impacts in regional Australia. New Zealand is already doing work on the impacts in New Zealand. So what are the impacts for employers? As I mentioned, we've got an employer survey. What are the impacts in terms of productivity, business sustainability and investment? We've already seen there's an early story from under the PLS that with tuna workers with the supply of tuna workers to one of the tuna businesses, that now the business is buying more vessels and looking at partnerships with Tuvaluan workers back at home in terms of vessels and future business opportunities. And then what's happening with the workers, the social inclusion of workers in host communities. Aside, that boosting church numbers and football teams is certainly part of that. But really unpacking what those dynamics are is another important area of research. So just to conclude, you know, John and Kirsty's paper highlighted the significant gaps in our knowledge, and thank you, and what Matt has outlined is, you know, there's a lot of similarities in the areas that we're all identifying as key important areas. So we want to work with research partners, the broader research community, as well as the World Bank and DevPol, to build a community of practice of labour mobility researchers and to build complementarity and collaboration, as well as do internal work. And also we want to be clear about, we see this as a partnership opportunity. We really want Pacific input to help define this agenda, and not to be just an agenda driven from Canberra. So I'll leave it there and I'll leave it to Jane to open it for discussion and your comments and inputs.
Thank you, Rochelle. Now, I have the awful task of trying to wrap us up. So, given that we're already over time, I think I'll invite the panel members to come up to the table. Matt and Rochelle, do you want to come up to the table, and Melione? I think what we'll do is 10 minutes of questions, because we do need some time to sort of close the proceedings at the end. So I think we'll have 10 minutes of questions or comments for the panel. And I encourage you, particularly if you've got new ideas, it's clear that I think the presentations we've heard this afternoon link back to John and Kirsty this morning, and there's actually a lot of overlap, and we're all thinking about a lot of similar things. So particularly if you've got something that we've missed, if there's something that hasn't been mentioned today, then please mention it now. So 10 minutes for questions or comments. Have we got one at the back there?
Hi, my name is Titus Matafin. I'm from I.T.S. So thank you so much to all the panel members for your presentations. I just had a comment, probably being spurred mostly by the last presentation from Rochelle. So it's great to see you talked about use of evidence and trying to link evidence back into policy and practice. And I just wanted to ask what the thinking is in terms of trying to bring all this evidence together. So we've been talking about so much research, and most of the times in this sector or in this area of work, we like to do more research without actually looking at what's out there and how we can use it to influence policy and practice. So what's the thinking across the labour mobility scheme to actually improve the use of the evidence that's already there, rather than going out to continue to generate more evidence? So just a reaction across from the panel.
Another question? Just behind you.
Yeah, again, a comment of Ron Duncan, Public Policy at Crawford. Villamani talked about looking at future jobs, and Matt also talked about skills, investment in skills in 5 to 10 years hence. I'd just like to remind people that technologists are absolutely useless in forecasting technology, and economists are absolutely useless in forecasting about jobs. So, I think we just should recognise those limitations. The question is, what do we do in terms of training people to fit in with these jobs that we don't know are coming up? And I guess, the broad answer to that is good reading, writing and arithmetic, the 3 R's, and whereas in Australia we're talking about now teaching young kids creative thinking and all sorts of rubbish that are coming into the schools, instead of focusing on the basics and eventually pushing them into STEM and places where doesn't matter what happens in the future, they'll be useful. Thanks.
Thank you. One more here, and then we'll go to the panel.
Thank you, panelists, for the deliberations on the topics that you covered. My name is Michele Rondono from the private industry sector. My question would reflect on all of you, not on anyone in particular, but on all on a common ground that I look at. Speaking from the experience of being a parent that lost my son in terms of going overseas to do studies, I would like to ask, in terms of the labor mobility, is there a research program been done to cater for the people going before and after they come back? Is the counseling? There is hardly here in Fiji and probably in the Pacific to do counseling in that regard. I've seen that in the army. I've seen that after Winston, and I've challenged government on this, that they don't have the capacity to do counseling, to counsel people aftermath and even before. What do we do as a nation, as a region? Thank you.
Thank you. Rochelle, would you like to start with Titus's question?
Yes, there's lots of data, but there's a lot of data that's not being collected too. And so under the facility, there'll be a lot of data generated, and we discussed yesterday about building comparability now data collection with APTC data collection, so we don't duplicate and overburden workers with too many questions, too many surveys, too many apps, all of that sort of stuff. And again, we'll need to work with the bank on that also. So I think there's a great opportunity for us to all sit together, bank, DevPol, APTC, PLF, to make sure that A, we've got the right data questions covered, and B, we don't overburden the key stakeholders, workers, employers, with too many questions. So we can align our collections and have obviously have collections that are fit for purpose. And anyone else for comments?
Yeah, sure. So I guess first of all, you asked a question about how do you bring this research together, and I guess that's a fair question. And that's, I mean, both Rochelle and I sort of emphasised the importance of working together. I mean, having said that, one thing that I didn't mention in my talk was that, bringing people together doesn't mean that we have to agree all the time. And I think that it is very useful to have disagreement and to have ideas contested. So that's something I would really emphasise. In terms of making data available, absolutely. It's really, really, really problematic in the Pacific, and I say that as a former researcher, and I think that's something where governments and also where donors can play a much more helpful role than what they have historically.
Any final comments from Billy?
Thank you. I'll just respond to the issue of counselling and our experience here in Fiji with the National Employment Centre. We see that as a very, very important intervention that the centre provides. So it's mandatory. So everyone that registered through our National Employment Centre, given that the context is they come from an unemployment background, they've been unemployed. So counselling is one of the primary interventions that's provided to them from the very beginning. Thank you.
There was a recent delegation of Vanuatu church leaders to Australia, and I understand from discussions with those church leaders that issues of not so much counselling, but more pastoral support for workers is being discussed with the Pacific Council of Churches. And I think there's a strong understanding of the need for the reach of the churches to provide support for families and for workers through for workers that are involved in labour mobility.
Thank you. Can you join with me in thanking our panel? And just one final comment from me, that I think, this really is the, the beginning. So I think, thank you for your comments and ideas. I think if the panel aren't in a rush this afternoon, they might be here. So if you didn't get a chance to raise your issue, please come down and have a chat to the panel after we finish. But don't go anywhere yet, as I'd like to invite Nilesh, Senior Lecturer here at the USP, to make some closing remarks.
Well, thank you very much. Here we are, although we're much quieter than how we were on Wednesday when you all started. So on behalf of USP, INU, School of Economics, Deaf Policy, and our two sponsors, I'd like to thank you for staying back. It was a pleasure hosting you all during the last 3 days. Just want to give you some numbers. We had about 91 presentations, apart from that, we had 350 registered participants who entered the 3-day conference. And I'd like to thank Stephen House and his team for helping us organize this conference. We're already looking forward to the conference next year. And I'd like to thank Matthew Donnan, who has been organizing this conference with me for the last 4 years, except this year, joined the World Bank. And I look forward to working with Ryan Edwards next year, who has replaced Matthew Donnan at the Deaf Policy Center. All the slides have already been uploaded on the School of Economics website, so if you want to go back and have a look, you'll find all the slides there. The recordings from this lecture theatre is archived on YouTube, so you can go and have a look at that as well. So once again, thank you very much for attending, and I look forward to your representation next year in NACA.
Let's get a photo before you stand up. Good to see you again, Billy. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Hope you're not jet lagged still. In Geneva.
Well, I'm getting back to normal now.
Yeah.